So let's actually parse some of that politics. Let's put this up there on the screen. CNN did an immediate reaction poll to all of this. And I think, it's important to state that whenever it's not actually the law of the land and you try and explain this to somebody who doesn't even know that much, like, well, what's a leak? What do you mean? What is a leak decision? Is it the law or not? It does get complicated. But, to show you the other side, the Supreme Court decision has not really shaken up the midterm landscape. 66% said Roe versus Wade should not be struck down. 59% said they would support Congress passing legislation to establish a nationwide right to abortion, including 81% of Democrats, 65% of independents, and 30% of Republicans. But comparing the results of a new poll to one conducted immediately before the revelation, the impact appears fairly muted. So the share of registered voters who say they are extremely or enthusiastic about voting this fall rose 6 points between the first survey and the second, but that increase is even across party lines. Even amongst Democrats, who they say are extremely or very enthusiastic, is up 7 points, but among Republicans, it's 56%, up 9 points. Voters who say that overturning Roe would make them happy are nearly twice as enthusiastic about voting this fall as those who say such a ruling would leave them angry. Only 38% extremely enthusiastic about those happy, 20% amongst those who are angry. And the share of Americans who would be angry in the wake of such a ruling is 36%, which of course outweighs the 17% who would be happy. But again, when you have, basically a double-digit enthusiasm gap, that is going to be the biggest thing. And the final thing I will say before I get your reaction, Krystal, is that abortion is just not the only factor for most voters.
Yeah.
Republicans hold a narrow edge on the generic ballot, 49 to 42, which is immense. 7 point, which, remember the Krystal and Saagar rule, add like 3 points.
Right.
10 points is more likely to see what it is whenever it's the GOP. And whenever you look at it, inflation is the number one concern amongst voters. Another Gallup thing came out. We'll be talking to Mohammed Yunus from Gallup. I'm sure we'll talk about this with him. Gallup, which came out this morning, we're like, hey, for the last year, single theme, we're getting hammered. Grocery store, gas, it's killing us at home. So look, this could be the one area where a material politics can trump everything, just because inflation is so out of hand for most people's pocketbook.
I think that the big question and why it makes it complicated to understand how this may all play out politically is because midterm elections are so much about base turnout. Mm-hmm. So you already had Republicans, like the people who are going to be super psyched that Roe was overturned, those people were already psyched up to vote for Republicans this fall. So the difference is, is this for young voters who were disgusted with the Biden administration, his approval rating has fallen off a cliff with them. Are they going to now be motivated to come out and vote for Democrats because of this decision? I don't know the answer to that. I think that's really an open question. I think the Democrats have a weak case to make of basically like, reelect us and we promise this time will be different and we'll actually do something about it. However, when you've got Mitch McConnell out there basically saying, yeah, we might do the federal ban, well, then the Democrats don't actually have to do anything because you can just say, well, listen, we may not be ready to codify Roe into law and provide you with the protection you actually want, but what they're doing is way worse. So once again, it gives the Democrats the ability to do nothing and just say, but we're a little better than the Republicans and, it's existential, so you have to come out and vote for us. Will it work? I don't know. I do think that if you were going to, probably the place where this may make things more difficult for Republicans and have the biggest impact is like in some of the suburban areas where they were hoping with Trump not on the ballot and where, parents have been frustrated with Democratic policies on schools, but also on, inflation and gas pumps and all that stuff. Maybe this helps to allow Democrats to shore up some of the voters that they had won in previous elections. Maybe that's the place where there's the biggest impact. It's really hard to say. It was really interesting. There was a comprehensive study of all of the abortion polling since Roe versus Wade was ultimately passed. Let's go ahead and throw this tear sheet up on the screen. This is from AEI, and it was pretty interesting digging into this, Saagar. They say attitudes about abortion, a comprehensive review of polls from the 1970s to today. One of the things that stands out the most is that people's sentiment hasn't changed much. It's remarkably steady on this issue.
Yeah. There was one weird pro-life increase in 2008. And since then, it's basically the exact same thing.
Overall, attitudes have basically existed within the same band, within the same margin for almost 50 years, there has been a little bit of an increase in the number of people who say that abortion should be legal in all circumstances, and a little bit of a decrease in the number of people who say it should be illegal in all circumstances. But overall, you continue to have a dynamic where, those two positions, the sort of, the most extreme positions are supported by the fewest numbers, and the bulk of people either say it should be legal in most but not all circumstances, or it should be illegal in most but all circumstances. And the other thing that really comes out is that the American people are able to hold two thoughts in their mind about abortion at the same time. Here's what they said in this. They say Americans appear to be simultaneously pro-life and pro-choice. Significant numbers of people say abortion is an act of murder, but they also say that the decision to have an abortion should be a personal choice. These are contradictory sentiments, yet many people hold them at the same time, and many see no reason to resolve the tensions in these positions. They believe in the sanctity of life, and they also believe in the importance of individual choice. I personally don't think that's crazy. I mean, you have two competing moral claims here.
Right.
And so most Americans are able to look at that and say, okay, well, there are some circumstances where, I'm really not comfortable when you talk very late in the pregnancy. That's a very different deal than very early on, and I feel very differently about it. I don't think that's a crazy thing whatsoever. And so when you take in the fact that people hold both of these thoughts in their mind, that's why when you end up being the party that's on the extreme side of this debate, you are not going to have the American public broadly with you. And even within the Republican Party, there's a significant chunk that is not going to be comfortable with always illegal in all circumstances from the day of conception and, from the moment you have a fetal heartbeat. There's a significant chunk of even the Republicans who are not comfortable with that.
Look, social libertarianism is baked into the Americans' blood, live and let live. So many people can say, well, I personally would not, go through with that. But, especially in an increasingly secular country, I mean, look, the country was dramatically more Christian in the 1970s whenever this happened, and people still, when they were literally church-going Christians, still said, yeah, I think it should probably be legal up until the first trimester. I mean, compare that to today. I'm not talking about atheism. I'm talking about like general secularization, decline in church-going membership, and all across the board in the way that people believe, agnosticism being dramatically increased, and even among self-identified Christians, the way that they actually believe in God is dramatically dropped over the last 20 to 30 years, especially in the last decade. Well, in that country, and especially amongst the Republicans, I've been, beating this probably to like a dead horse, but the new culture war is not theocratic, really, in nature at all. And that's part of the problem, which is that this returns us to the 1990s types of debates where actually a lot of the political correctness movement was on the left back in the 90s against the moral majority of the right.
Yeah.
So it really is scrambling the way that a lot of things are. It's kind of a return to like almost a South Park era, like during the George W. Bush administration in terms of making fun of and going after theocratic Christians. That really is the change. Where it's like a flash in the pan moment that reminds us that these wars are not 100% settled. I think it's pretty interesting, in terms of that survey of the data, that even in a very, very much more Christian nation at the time, the sentiment really has not changed all that much.
Yeah, it really is interesting. It's another one where there's a little bit of generational differences, but not much, which is also very unusual in terms of our politics.
Right.
Most of the issues that we talk about in debate here, younger generations tend to be much more liberal, much more progressive. Here, there isn't quite that divide, which I guess makes sense when you talk about older generations having personal firsthand experience with what this actually looked like and the sort of visceral fights of that time. But overall, looking at the polling, I think you'd be hard-pressed to make the case that this totally, changes the game for Democrats. But do you now have Republicans on the defensive, having to try to spin like, Governor Tate Reeves of Mississippi did that we were just talking about, and say, well, yeah, that sounds really terrible, making a woman carry pregnancy to term who was raped, but it doesn't happen all that often. That's just not a strong leg to stand on. It's not a strong leg for Democrats to stand on when they say, partial birth abortion, you might not like it, it might feel like really terrible to you, but it doesn't happen that often. If you believe that something is morally wrong, it's morally wrong whether it happens in one instance or 1,000 or 100,000 instances. So point. I don't think that that's a particularly compelling dodge here, ultimately, that it doesn't happen that often. And your point about all it takes is one horrific morally outrageous instance where you put a face and a name and you really viscerally understand this to actually completely upend the national debate and have a significant impact on our politics.
It's happened before, it can happen again.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.